am your host, Miss Marple. Welcome to my channel, Sherlock Midnight Echo. Remember, every quiet village hides a secret.
Chapter 1. The sky over the village of Oakhaven was a brilliant, cloudless blue, carrying the sharp, crisp edge of late October. It was the sort of clear, invigorating afternoon that suggested all was right with the world, and that the greatest tragedy one might face was a failed sponge cake at the upcoming autumn fair. Inside the drafty but cheerful reading room of the Oakhaven Public Library, the charity organizing committee was engaged in its usual Tuesday rituals. The air smelled comfortably of old paper, floor wax, and the Earl Grey tea steeping in a chipped floral pot on the central table. Miss Jane Marple sat situated near the radiator, her needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a fluffy white baby garment of indeterminate shape. To the casual observer, she was entirely absorbed in her knitting, a sweet, fragile old lady who had simply come in out of the cold. In truth, Miss Marple's faded blue eyes missed very little. She possessed a mind exquisitely attuned to the undercurrents of human nature, and the Oakhaven reading room was a veritable symphony of quiet resentments. "I simply do not see why we must have the tombola in the damp end of the hall," declared Mrs. Beatrice Thorne, adjusting her spectacles. She was a woman who approached village life with the strategic aggression of a military campaign. "Major Sterling, surely you agree the draft will ruin the raffle tickets." Major Sterling, a man whose permanent state of mild exasperation was etched into the deep lines of his forehead, merely grunted. "Put the tombola wherever you like, Beatrice. Just don't ask me to draw the tickets." Henrietta Dashwood, the young, rather nervous head librarian, fluttered around the table distributing cups of tea. I think the front entrance might be best, Mrs. Thorne. Oh, by the way, the afternoon post arrived just before you all came in. There was a letter addressed to the committee." "Well, open it, Henrietta," Mrs. Thorne said briskly, taking her tea. "Likely another complaint from the baker about the pricing of the scones. I told him a shilling was perfectly fair." Henrietta wiped her hands on her woolen skirt, picked up a stark white envelope from the circulation desk, and slit it open with a brass letter opener. She unfolded the single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper. As Henrietta read the words to herself, a strange, profound stillness overtook her. The teacup in her other hand rattled violently against its saucer. "Whatever is the matter, dear?" asked Miss Marple softly, her knitting needles pausing for a fraction of a second. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." I don't understand," Henrietta stammered, her face entirely drained of color. "It must be a joke, a very poor sort of joke." "Give it here," Mrs. Thorne demanded, snatching the paper from the younger woman's trembling fingers. She cleared her throat and held the letter up to the light, her voice ringing out with customary authority. But as she read the typewritten words aloud, even her formidable confidence seemed to falter. "Notice to the residents of Oakhaven, a murder has been scheduled to take place tomorrow evening, Wednesday the 28th of October, at exactly 8 o'clock. The event will occur within the confines of the Oakhaven Library. You are cordially invited to witness the inevitable." This is the only intimation. A heavy, breathless silence descended upon the reading room. The cheerful ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner suddenly sounded deafening. "Preposterous," sputtered Major Sterling, his neck flushing a deep, mottled red. "Some wretched delinquent with a typewriter and too much time on their hands. Ought to be thrashed, but who would send such a thing to the charity committee?" Mrs. Thorne asked, looking around the room as if the culprit might be hiding behind the encyclopedias. "It's completely senseless." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, resuming her knitting. "Click-clack, click-clack. Although, in my experience, very few things are truly senseless. Human beings usually have a reason for what they do, even if it is a very wicked one. You don't seriously think someone intends to commit a murder in my library tomorrow night?" Henrietta asked, her voice tight with panic. "I shouldn't worry too much, Miss Dashwood," the Major said gruffly, though he kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. "Just an idle threat. Probably one of the village teenagers trying to frighten us." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mild eyes moved thoughtfully from face to face. She noticed how Major Sterling's hand unconsciously tightened into a fist until his knuckles turned white. She observed the way Mrs. Thorne had folded the letter, her thumb pressing so hard into the paper that the nail was entirely bloodless. And she saw Henrietta Dashwood cast a quick, terrified glance toward the closed door of the library's rare book archive. It reminded Miss Marple rather vividly of little Tommy Barnes back in Sainty. Mary Mead. Tommy had once marched into the village shop and loudly announced that someone was going to break the glass candy jar at noon. Everyone had laughed and called him an imaginative boy, but Miss Marple had known Tommy's nature. He was a deeply envious child who resented that he had no pocket money. The jar had indeed shattered at noon, and though Tommy had an airtight alibi, Miss Marple knew he had carefully loosened the shelf bracket an hour prior. People who announce their malice, Miss Marple reflected, rarely do so out of a desire to be caught. They do it because the anticipation is part of their revenge. They want the fear to set in first. "I believe," Miss Marple said cheerfully, examining a dropped stitch in her fluffy white wool, "that I shall bring my knitting to the library tomorrow evening. The lighting in here is so much better than at my lodgings. And one never knows when a bit of company might be required." Chapter 2. By Wednesday morning, the quiet streets of Oakhaven were practically humming with a nervous, electric energy. An English village, as Miss Marple knew, possessed a network of communication that rivaled any telegraph system. Before the milkman had finished his rounds, the contents of the typewritten letter delivered to the charity committee were common knowledge from the grandest manor down to the smallest cottage. At the counter of Higgins and Sons, grocers, the atmosphere was thick with speculation. Miss Game. Beatrice Thorne stood with her basket over her arm, pointing an accusatory finger at a display of winter squashes. "It is the breakdown of modern discipline. That's what it is," she proclaimed to anyone within earshot. "In my father's day, young people had respect for public property. Announcing a violent crime in a library. It is a symptom of a deeply permissive society." Mr. Higgins, wiping his damp hands on his canvas apron, leaned forward with an air of profound conspiracy. "They say, Missy Thorne, that it's a clever publicity stunt. My nephew works over in Milchester, and he says libraries do all sorts of odd things nowadays to get people through the doors. Murder mystery evenings, they call them, very popular with the younger town crowds." "A publicity stunt," Mrs. Thorne scoffed, her formidable bosom heaving with deep indignation. "Henrietta Dashwood hasn't got the imagination for a publicity stunt. The girl trembles if a historical volume is returned 3 days late. No, it is malice, pure and simple." A few feet away, seemingly engrossed in selecting the perfect jar of blackcurrant jam, Miss Marple listened with quiet amusement. She knew that people almost always projected their own private preoccupations onto a mystery. Mrs. Thorne, who viewed life as a perpetual battle against social disorder, saw a moral failing. Mr. Higgins, a pragmatic businessman, saw a clever marketing ploy. Further down the high street, right outside the brick post office, another fierce debate was already raging. Major Sterling was being cornered by Miss Clarissa Mead, a lady of advanced years and an insatiable, lifelong appetite for intense melodrama. "But Major," Miss Mead squeaked, clutching her fox fur stole tightly against the bitter morning chill, "surely the county police must be called. We could all be murdered in our beds tonight. I didn't sleep a single wink, fully expecting a masked assassin to burst through my rear scullery window." The Major looked thoroughly miserable, his grey mustache twitching with absolute irritation. "Confound it, Clarissa. Don't be hysterical. There is no assassin. It's a hoax. A thoughtless schoolboy prank designed to make complete fools of us all. If we call the regional police from Milchester, we'll be the laughingstock of the entire district. Local Constable Evans completely agrees with me. He thinks it's utter rubbish. And yet," Miss Marple's gentle, paper-thin voice interrupted as she drifted toward them, carrying a small striped bag of peppermint drops. "Dear Constable Evans is such a very young man, isn't he? He reminds me so much of poor Arthur Pendleton's eldest nephew. Arthur's nephew always insisted that the strange scraping noises in the cellar were just stray rats, until the kitchen floorboards collapsed entirely from undetected dry rot. Such a dreadful pity about the grandmother clock that fell right through." Major Sterling shot Miss Marple a sharp, defensive glance. This isn't dry rot, Miss Marple. It's nothing but an empty, malicious threat. Of course, Major, Miss Marple replied, her eyes remarkably clear and bright behind her thick spectacles. But one does wonder why the clever person chose 8 o'clock precisely. It is a very specific hour, isn't it? Just when the library closes its main doors to the public. But before dear Henrietta locks up the private archives, it shows such an intimate, detailed knowledge of our quiet local schedule. The Major's weathered face stiffened, a dark shadow passing over his features before he abruptly tipped his tweed hat and walked quickly away, his heavy cane clicking sharply against the stone pavement. Miss Mead watched his retreat, leaning closer to Miss Marple. He's terribly high-strung, don't you think? They say his army pension isn't what it used to be, and he's been having dreadful, shouting arguments with his investment manager. Miss Marple smiled, popping a peppermint into her mouth. The village was reacting as she expected, a swirling eddy of gossip and skepticism. Everyone was talking, but no one was truly looking. They were far too busy constructing shields of denial or excitement to notice the subtle undercurrents of fear lurking beneath the surface. Oakhaven was waiting for 8 o'clock, suspended between the hope of a thrilling spectacle and the unconfessed dread of a very real executioner. Chapter 3. As the hands of the grandfather clock in the Oakhaven Public Library crept closer to 7:30. The heavy oak doors opened and closed with unusual frequency. The evening was bitterly cold, yet a strange, irresistible gravity seemed to draw the villagers inside. No one wished to admit they were there because of the typed letter, yet nearly everyone had found an urgent, undeniable need to consult a reference book or return a overdue volume. Henrietta Dashwood sat behind the high-circulation desk, her fingers trembling so violently that she could barely stamp the due date cards. Her skin possessed an unnatural, porcelain paleness under the harsh electric lights. Every time the brass bell above the door chimed, she flinched, her eyes darting instinctively toward the dark, heavily paneled door of the rare book archive at the back of the room. Miss Marple sat comfortably in her usual corner by the radiator, her fingers moving with serene rhythm as she continued to knit her fluffy white baby garment. Her presence was remarkably soothing, a stark contrast to the thick, palpable tension vibrating through the rest of the room. Nearby, Mrs. Beatrice Thorne was aggressively flipping through a large atlas, though she had been staring at the exact same map of the Mediterranean for nearly 20 minutes. She kept checking her gold wristwatch, her mouth set in a thin, rigid line of severe disapproval. "If this is indeed a prank," she muttered loudly to no one inches particular, "the person responsible should be made to pay for the wasted electricity." It is nearly 7:45. Major Sterling stood by the military history section, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He wasn't even pretending to read. His eyes were fixed entirely on the main entrance, his heavy jaw clenched so tightly that a small muscle twitched repeatedly in his cheek. He looked like a soldier waiting in a trench for an imminent artillery barrage, his posture stiff and defensive. "A remarkably full house for a Wednesday evening, isn't it?" whispered Miss Clarissa Mead, slipping into the chair right next to Miss Marple. Clarissa was practically vibrating with intense excitement, her eyes wide as she scanned the room. "Even young Dr. Shepherd has just walked in. He claims he needed a medical dictionary, but look at him, he hasn't even opened a single page. He's just staring at the clock." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her faded blue eyes mild and remarkably clear. "It is very true, dear. Human curiosity is a most powerful force. It reminds me so much of old Mr. Badger from St. T. Mary Mead. He always insisted on watching the blacksmith temper the iron, despite being warned about the dangerous flying sparks. One day, a spark caught his waistcoat, and he was quite badly singed. People simply cannot resist looking at the fire." "Do you really think there will be a fire tonight, Miss Marple?" Henrietta asked, her voice cracking slightly as she joined them, carrying a fresh stack of wooden catalogue drawers to organize. "I think, my dear, that someone has gone to an extraordinary amount of trouble to ensure we are all gathered here together," Miss Marple replied softly. "And when people take that much trouble, they generally have a very specific purpose in mind." She watched carefully as Henrietta set the heavy drawers down, Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed a tiny dark stain on the cuff of Henrietta's woolen sleeve, a deep reddish-brown smudge that had certainly not been there during the Tuesday committee meeting. Furthermore, Miss Marple observed that the girl's keys, usually pinned securely to her waistband, were missing entirely. The minutes ticked away with an agonizing, deliberate slowness. The cheerful warmth of the reading room now felt suffocating, thick with the unspoken fears of a dozen people. At exactly 5 minutes to 8, the heavy iron street lamp outside the library window flickered twice, and then went out entirely, plunging the pavement outside into a dense, impenetrable blackness. Inside, the sudden darkness outside made the interior lights seem overly bright, casting long, distorted shadows across the rows of silent books. Major Sterling stepped closer to the center of the room, his hand slipping inside his heavy tweed overcoat. Mrs. Thorne stopped, turning her pages. The only sound left in the entire building was the rhythmic, relentless ticking of the grandfather clock. 79 minutes past 7. Miss Marple quietly folded her knitting and placed it into her basket. She looked not at the clock, nor at the door, but at the reflection of the room in the dark window pane, waiting for the final mechanism of the trap to spring. Chapter 4. The grandfather clock began its deep, resonant chime, striking the first note of 8 o'clock. With each heavy toll, the tension in the reading room tightened like a piano wire. On the fourth stroke, just as the sound began to echo against the high ceiling, the overhead electric lights sputtered violently and died. Total, pitch-black darkness swallowed the room. A sharp, collective gasp ruptured the silence, followed immediately by the chaotic sounds of scraping chair legs and rustling heavy coats. Miss Clarissa Meade shrieked, a high-pitched, piercing sound of pure terror that cut through the gloom. "Stay exactly where you are, everyone." Major Sterling's authoritative voice boomed out, cutting through the rising panic. "Don't move a muscle, Henrietta. Where are the emergency candles?" Before Henrietta could answer, a heavy, metallic thud echoed from the back of the building, followed by the distinctive, agonizing screech of a rusted iron bolt being forced open. It came from the direction of the rare book archive. A sudden, freezing gust of night air swept through the reading room, carrying the smell of damp earth and dead leaves, confirming that an exterior door had been breached. "Someone's back there?" sputtered Mr. Higgins, his voice cracking with anxiety. Then came the sound. It was a single, sharp, deafening crack that shattered the stillness of the library, the unmistakable report of a small-caliber pistol. For 2 seconds, nobody breathed. Then, a heavy groan cut through the darkness, followed by the dull, sickening sound of a body collapsing onto the wooden floorboards of the archive. Footsteps sprinted away, fading rapidly into the gravel path outside the building. Matches, confound it. Someone strike a light. Major Sterling shouted, his boots stomping heavily against the floor as he stumbled blindly toward the circulation desk. A match flared, illuminating the terrified, sweat-sheened face of Dr. Shepherd. With trembling fingers, he managed to light a thick tallow candle resting on the counter. The weak, flickering yellow flame cast long, monstrous shadows across the walls, revealing the pale, horrified faces of the Oakoven villagers. Everyone was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sudden arrival of the promised horror. Miss Marple remained seated calmly in her corner, her face shadowed, but her posture perfectly composed. While the others stared in shock at the candle, her sharp eyes were fixed on the floor near the entrance, tracking the quick movements of the individuals closest to the back corridor. "Doctor, with me," the major ordered, snapped, snatching the candle from Shepherd's hand. The 2 men hurried toward the rear of the library, the light retreating with them and plunging the main room back into a dim, ghostly twilight. Mrs. Thorne stood rigid by her table, her hands clutching her chest. "It happened," she whispered, her voice devoid of its usual booming authority. "It actually happened, just as the letter said, from the dark depths of the archive." Shepherd's voice rang out, hollow and grim. "Major, hold the light closer. Oh, dear Lord. Is it?" the major stammered, his military composure completely shattering. "He's dead, Dr. Shepherd," confirmed flatly. "Shot straight through the heart. He couldn't have survived more than a few seconds." A collective murmur of dread washed over the main room. Henrietta Dashwood sank slowly into her chair, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, violent sobs. Miss Marple quietly stood up, smoothing the front of her tweed skirt. She did not rush toward the scene of the crime like Miss Mead, who was peering into the corridor with morbid fascination. Instead, Miss Marple stepped delicately toward the circulation desk. In the dim, flickering shadows, she noticed a small detail that everyone else had overlooked in the frenzy. Resting on the very edge of the desk, right where Henrietta had been working, was a single bright brass key. It was the key to the rare book archive, the very key that had been missing from Henrietta's waistband just 15 minutes earlier. Miss Marple did not touch it. She merely looked at it, her mind cataloguing the placement with a deep, sorrowful sigh. It reminded her so much of old Mr. Gribble's shop, where the drawer containing the petty cash was always found unlocked whenever his young assistant wished to blame a passing tramp for a missing sovereign. The presentation of a vulnerability was often the greatest clue of all. Chapter 5. Within 10 minutes, the local constable, Evans, had arrived, looking thoroughly out of his depth. The young officer's uniform cap was slightly askew, and his face was almost as pale as Henrietta's. He stood in the doorway of the rare book archive, staring down at the lifeless body of a stranger. The victim was a man in his late 40s, dressed in an expensive but mud-splattered trench coat, his pockets completely empty of any identification. "I don't recognize him at all," Constable Evans muttered, nervously chewing the end of his pencil as he looked toward Major Sterling and Dr. Shepherd. "He doesn't belong to Oakhaven, that's for certain. What on earth was he doing in the restricted archive at 8 o'clock? "The letter, you foolish boy." Mrs. Thorne barked from the doorway, having somewhat recovered her formidable composure. "The letter told us exactly when and where this tragedy would happen. The question isn't why he was here, but who lured him to his death." "Well, it seems perfectly obvious to me," Major Sterling said, crossing his arms and gesturing toward the weeping librarian. "Look at the facts. Henrietta has the only key to that archive door. The back entrance was bolted from the inside until a few moments before the shot. And look at her desk. The key is sitting right there in plain sight. She must have unlocked it for him or let the killer in beforehand." Henrietta raised her tear-stained face, her eyes wide with frantic denial. "No, I didn't. I swear I didn't unlock it. My keys were missing from my belt when I arrived this afternoon. I thought I had simply mislaid them at home. I have no idea how that key got onto the desk. A very convenient story." Mrs. Thorne sniffed, looking down her nose at the girl. "You've been incredibly nervous all day, Henrietta. We all saw you. And let's not forget that your father's old service revolver is exactly the type of weapon Dr. Shepherd thinks was used." Constable Evans shifted on his feet, looking incredibly eager to close the case without having to involve the intimidating regional detectives from Milchester. "It does look rather bad, Miss Dashwood. If the keys were in your possession and you were the only one with access to the archives." Miss Marple quietly stepped forward from the shadows of the corridor, her knitting basket balanced gently on her arm. "Excuse me, dear Constable, but human nature is such a curious thing, isn't it? It so often reminds me of young Clara Higgins, no relation to our excellent grocer, of course, who was accused of stealing the church altar cloths simply because she held the vestry keys." Major Sterling sighed heavily. "Miss Marple, with all due respect, this is a matter of police business, not village gossip." "Oh, quite so, Major," Miss Marple replied mildly, her faded blue eyes blinking innocently behind her spectacles. "But you see, poor Clara hadn't stolen the cloths at all. The real thief had merely used a bit of sticky wax to take an impression of her keys while they were hanging unattended on the kitchen peg. It is remarkably easy to duplicate a key if one has access to a household." She turned her gaze toward the floor just inside the archive door, pointing a delicate, wrinkled finger at a small object resting near the baseboard. "And speaking of things left behind, I couldn't help but notice that rather lovely silk handkerchief lying just under the catalogue cabinet. It seems to have a very distinct monogram on the corner." Constable Evans knelt down quickly, picking up the square of fine white silk with his fountain pen. He held it up to the candlelight, squinting at the embroidered initials. "S," he read aloud. The reading room went completely silent. Everyone instinctively turned to look at Major Spencer Sterling. The Major's face turned an alarming shade of purple, his mustache twitching violently. That is preposterous. I've never seen that handkerchief in my life. Someone is trying to frame me. But Major, Miss Mead piped up from the back, her voice shrill with excitement. You were standing right by the history section, closest to the archive corridor when the lights went out. And everyone knows you've been desperately trying to find a buyer for your late uncle's rare collection of military maps, the very maps kept in this archive. Chapter 6. The accusation hung heavily in the frosty air of the library, the monogrammed handkerchief seeming to glow with a quiet malice under the flickering candle flame. Major Sterling looked wildly around the room, his chest heaving as the weight of the villagers' suspicion shifted entirely onto his shoulders. "This is a monstrous conspiracy," he hissed, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. "I have not touched those archive doors, and I certainly haven't shot anyone." "Then how do you explain the handkerchief, Major?" Mrs. Thorne asked, her voice dripping with ice. "It is a well-known fact that your family uses that particular silk merchant in Milchester, and your financial difficulties are hardly a secret in Oakhaven anymore. A collection of rare Elizabethan military maps would fetch a handsome sum on the black market, wouldn't it?" Miss Marple watched the confrontation with a look of gentle sorrow on her face. She was not looking at the Major, however. Instead, her eyes were fixed on the far corner of the reading room, where the large atlas Mrs. Thorne had been reading earlier still lay open on the oak table. The light from Dr. Shepherd's single candle cast long shadows across the pages, but Miss Marple's sharp sight captured something else. A tiny, crumpled scrap of paper resting just beneath the heavy mahogany leg of the table itself. Quietly, while Constable Evans was occupied trying to calm the sputtering Major, Miss Marple drifted away from the group. She moved with the slow, frail steps of an old lady who was simply overwhelmed by the excitement. When she reached the table, she dropped her ball of fluffy white wool. As she bent down with a soft groan to retrieve it, her nimble fingers flicked the scrap of paper out from under the table leg and into the palm of her hand. Straightening up, she smoothed her skirt and walked near the window to examine her find by the pale moonlight filtering through the glass. It was a fragment of a railway timetable from the Milchester line, dated for that very afternoon. On the back, written in a hurried, elegant script that did not belong to Henrietta Dashwood, were the words 8 o'clock. "The side door will be unbolted." A quiet click in Miss Marple's mind signaled another piece of the puzzle falling into place. It reminded her so much of old Mr. Elkins, the churchwarden, who had gone to extraordinary lengths to prove that the travelling gypsies had stolen the silver communion plate, even going so far as to leave a trail of horsehair leading to their camp. But Mr. Elkins had forgotten that he himself had been seen purchasing a very specific brand of metal polish the Tuesday before. People who plan their crimes with such meticulous detail almost always leave a trace of their own neatness behind. "Look here," Constable Evans announced, his voice trembling slightly as he gingerly reached into the dead man's trench coat sleeve, pulling out a small leather-bound notebook that had been tucked into the lining. "The pockets are empty, but he hid this. There's a name written inside the front cover." The small crowd pressed forward, eager for any revelation. Evans squinted at the elegant script by the light of the tallow candle. "Julian Vance," the constable read aloud. "The book belongs to a Mr. Julian Vance of London." Hearing the name, Henrietta gave a sharp, strangled cry and covered her mouth, her eyes widening in absolute horror. "Missy?" Thorne stiffened, her hand flying to her throat as if she had suddenly been choked by her own pearl necklace. Even Major Sterling stopped his shouting, his face turning an ash-grey colour in the dim light. "Julian," Miss Mead whispered, her eyes darting between the villagers. "But wasn't that the name of the young man who—" She trailed off, glancing fearfully at Mrs. Thorne, who looked as though she might faint. Miss Marple stood quietly by the window, folding the railway scrap into her pocket. The web of secrets was unravelling beautifully, just as the killer had intended it to. But the killer had made one fundamental error. They had assumed that because Miss Marple was an old woman from a quiet village, she would only see the threads they wanted her to look at. They did not realize she was looking at the weaver, Chapter 7. The revelation of the name Julian Vance seemed to strike the room like a physical blow. Mrs. Thorne's usual rigid posture crumbled slightly, her hand clutching the edge of the mahogany table for support. "Julian," she whispered, her voice stripped of its customary venom. "It can't be. He was supposed to be in South America. He promised he would never return to Oakhaven." Constable Evans looked between the terrified faces of the villagers, his confusion growing by the second. "Who exactly is Julian Vance, Mrs. Thorne? And why does his presence here cause such a stir?" It was Miss Clarissa Meade who broke the silence, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and poorly concealed excitement. "He was the young man who managed the village estate office 5 years ago. Constable, a charming boy, or so we all thought. Until a massive deficit was discovered in the charity funds, the very funds Mrs. Thorne and Major Sterling were overseeing. Before the police could be called, Julian vanished into thin air, taking the remaining village savings with him. And my daughter's heart, Mrs. Thorne added bitterly, her eyes flashing with a sudden dangerous spark of anger. He ruined her reputation, stole our security, and left us to pick up the pieces of our shattered lives. If he came back here, he came for blackmail, or worse, which gives almost everyone in this room a perfect motive to wish him dead," Major Sterling interjected grimly, though his own face remained deeply troubled. "But I assure you, I did not shoot him. I didn't even know the scoundrel was back in England." While the arguments flared anew, Miss Marple remained quietly observant. She noted how Dr. Shepherd had stepped away from the body, his hands buried deep inside his medical coat pockets, his gaze fixed intensely on the dark, unbolted rear door of the archive. The cold night air was still rushing into the room, causing the single candle flame to dance wildly, casting grotesque, elongated shadows against the rows of ancient leather-bound books. Suddenly, a strange metallic clatter echoed from the far side of the archive, near the restricted section where the rare Elizabethan maps were kept. It was a sharp, distinct sound, like a heavy set of iron keys being dropped onto a stone floor. "What was that?" Constable Evans shouted, drawing his truncheon with a trembling hand. "Is someone else still inside the building?" Major Sterling snatched the candle from the desk, and the small group moved cautiously into the narrow, claustrophobic aisles of the archive. The weak yellow light illuminated the high shelves, throwing the deep recesses of the room into stark relief. As they reached the very end of the corridor, the candlelight caught a horrific sight that made Henrietta scream aloud and drop to her knees. Dr. Shepherd was already on the floor, but he wasn't examining a patient this time. Another figure lay slumped against the base of the map cabinet. It was the village grocer, Mr. Higgins. His eyes were wide with a blank, unseeing stare, and a dark, sticky pool of crimson was rapidly spreading across the front of his canvas apron. Beside his twitching hand lay a heavy iron crowbar and a shattered wooden crate that had once contained the rare military maps. "He's been stabbed," Dr. Shepherd whispered, his fingers pressing against Higgins's neck before he slowly shook his head. "Just moments ago. The wound is still bleeding profusely. The killer must have been hiding in the shadows of the stacks while we were arguing in the main reading room." Panic, pure and absolute, erupted among the villagers. The realization that a ruthless killer was still trapped in the dark building with them turned their suspicion into a frantic desire for self-preservation. Constable Evans blew his whistle loudly, the shrill sound echoing uselessly against the stone walls. Miss Marple, however, did not panic. She stepped closer to the fallen grocer, her sharp eyes noticing a peculiar detail. Mr. Sandingan." Higgins's fingers were tightly clenched around a small piece of torn blue fabric, a distinct coarse wool that matched neither the Major's tweed nor Henrietta's delicate sweater. It was a fragment of a very specific type of winter coat, one that Miss Marple had seen worn by someone else entirely earlier that afternoon. The second crime had successfully shifted the focus, throwing the entire investigation into complete chaos, just as the hidden architect intended. But to Miss Marple's brilliant, calculating mind, the second murder did not complicate the puzzle. Rather, it stripped away the clever illusions. The killer was running out of time, and in their desperation to cover their tracks, they had finally left a thread that could not be explained away as a mere coincidence. Chapter 8. The shrill echo of the police whistle gradually died away, leaving a heavy, suffocating dread in the narrow aisles of the archive. The villagers pressed against one another, their eyes darting into the dark corners of the book stacks where the shadows seemed to stretch and twist. The presence of a second body had shattered the remaining illusions of a clever game or a simple village scandal. A desperate, calculating monster was trapped inside the Oakhaven Public Library. With them, lock the main doors, Major Sterling commanded. Taking charge as Constable Evans continued to tremble. Evans, guard the back entrance. Nobody enters or leaves this building until the county detectives arrive from Milchester. We are all witnesses, and one of us is an executioner. While the major and the panicked constable coordinated the lockdown, Miss Marple quietly retreated from the gruesome scene in the archive. She returned to the relative quiet of the main reading room, her footsteps making no sound on the worn carpet. The single candle on the circulation desk had burned down significantly, its flame drowning in a pool of melted tallow. Miss Marple did not look at the door, nor did she join the anxious whispers of Mrs. Thorne and Miss Mead near the history section. Instead, she sat down in her familiar chair by the radiator, picking up her knitting basket. Her hands were perfectly steady as she drew out the fluffy white wool. But she did not begin to knit. She simply waited, her mind arranging the final pieces of the mosaic. It reminded her so very much of old Mrs. Gable from St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Gable had once loudly announced to the entire parish that her prize-winning leeks had been stolen by a rival gardener, pointing to a muddy pair of boots left near her greenhouse. But Miss Marple had noticed that the mud on the boots was river clay, whereas the rival's garden was entirely chalky soil. Miss A. Bend. Gable had hidden the leeks herself to accuse her neighbor of malice, only to realize later that a completely different thief had taken her silver spoons while she was busy staging the theatrical distraction. A soft rustle of fabric interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Shepherd emerged from the archive corridor, wiping his hands on a linen handkerchief. His face was a mask of professional exhaustion. His shoulders slumped as he approached the circulation desk to collect his medical bag. "A terrible business, Miss Marple," Dr. Shepherd said softly, his voice carrying a deep, somber resonance in the empty room. "2 men dead in the span of less than half an hour. I fear Oakhaven will never truly recover from the horror of this dreadful evening." "It is indeed a very sad state of affairs, Doctor," Miss Marple replied, her tone remarkably conversational, almost cheerful. "Human greed is a modern tragedy. But then, as I often say, people are rarely as complicated as they wish us to believe. They usually want something very simple, like money or safety or revenge." She reached into her knitting basket, her fingers brushing past the white wool to find the small, crumpled scrap of the railway timetable she had retrieved from beneath the mahogany table earlier. "Tell me, Doctor," Miss Marple continued, her faded blue eyes locking onto his with a sudden razor-sharp clarity that belied her frail appearance. "Did your train journey from Milchester this afternoon prove entirely satisfactory? The line has been experiencing such dreadful delays lately, especially the 4 o'clock service that brings passengers into Oakhaven just in time for an evening stroll past the library." Dr. Shepherd froze, his hand remaining motionless on the strap of his medical bag. The weak candlelight flickered across his features, catching the sudden, rigid tightening of his jaw. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. I have been at my surgery all afternoon attending to patients." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple murmured, holding up the tiny scrap of paper so the moonlight caught it perfectly. "But you see, this particular fragment of the Milchester timetable has a very distinct smudge of blue ointment on the corner. The exact same antiseptic ointment you used to treat young Tommy Barnes's grazed knee yesterday morning. It is a very unique scent, Doctor. One that lingers quite stubbornly on the fingers." Chapter 9. The silence that followed Miss Marple's quiet observation was more profound than the darkness that had swallowed the library earlier. Dr. Shepherd did not move. He stood perfectly rigid by the circulation desk, the flickering candlelight casting a long, sinister shadow across his face. The soft, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to count down the seconds as the mask of the kindly village doctor began to slip away. "You are an extraordinarily imaginative woman, Miss Marple," Dr. Shepherd said, his voice dropping its warm, professional resonance and becoming chillingly flat. A smudge of ointment on a scrap of paper is hardly a matter for a court of law. I am a physician. I carry many scents upon my hands. It proves absolutely nothing. "Perhaps not by itself, dear doctor," Miss Marple replied gently, her knitting needles remaining still in her lap. "But when combined with human nature, the picture becomes painfully clear. You see, when poor Mr. Higgins was found stabbed in the archive stacks, his fingers were tightly gripping a torn fragment of coarse blue wool. It was a very specific fabric identical to the heavy winter coat you wore into the library this evening, the very coat you so carefully concealed inside your large leather medical bag before Constable Evans arrived." Dr. Shepherd's eyes darted toward his medical bag, his knuckles whitening as his grip on the leather strap tightened. "Julian Vance did not vanish 5 years ago to escape the law," Miss Marple continued, her faded blue eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful wisdom. "He vanished because he discovered that you were the one actually embezzling the charity funds. You used your position of absolute trust in this village to manipulate the books. And when Julian threatened to expose you, you forced him to flee under the threat of a staged prosecution. But Julian grew tired of running. He returned to England, completely broke, and he sent that typewritten letter to the committee to ensure a public audience when he finally confronted you." "A ridiculous fantasy," Shepherd hissed, stepping a fraction closer to her chair. "I was standing right next to the others when the shot was fired in the dark." "Yes, you were," Miss Marple agreed softly, "because you had already murdered him. You arrived early on the 4 o'clock train, entered through the side door using the duplicate key you made from Henrietta's waistband weeks ago, and shot Julian Vance before the meeting even began. You left his body in the locked archive. The theatrical announcement, the sudden power failure, and the loud report of the pistol at 8 o'clock were all part of a beautifully staged illusion. The sound we heard wasn't a pistol killing a man. It was a blank cartridge fired from a starter's pistol, timed perfectly to go off automatically when the clock struck 8, giving you an absolute airtight alibi in the dark." Shepherd took a sharp, ragged breath, his composure fracturing completely. "And Higgins, poor Mr. Higgins, was simply a greedy man," Miss Marple sighed. "He cared nothing for the murder. He saw the confusion as a golden opportunity to steal the rare Elizabethan maps he had coveted for years. He slipped into the archive with a crowbar while we were distracted. But he unfortunately caught you in the dark as you were trying to retrieve the real murder weapon from its hiding place behind the stacks. You had no choice but to silence him with your surgical scalpel." The heavy oak door of the reading room creaked open, and Major Sterling stepped out of the shadows of the corridor, flanked by a pale but determined Constable Evans. They had been standing just out of sight, listening to every syllable of the old lady's calm, devastating breakdown of the crime. "It's over, Shepherd," Major Sterling said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and profound betrayal. "Evans has already checked your medical bag. The blue coat is inside, and the torn shoulder matches the fragment in Higgins's hand perfectly. Give me the bag." Dr. Shepherd looked at the Major, then down at the fragile old woman, sitting quietly by the radiator. A bitter, defeated smile touched his lips. He slowly let the leather bag slide from his fingers, allowing it to hit the wooden floorboards with a dull, final thud. Chapter 10. By midnight. The heavy oak doors of the Oakhaven Public Library had finally closed behind the regional detectives. From Milchester, Dr. Shepherd had been led away in handcuffs, his cold, professional silence a stark contrast to the frantic protests of innocence he had offered only an hour before. The rain had begun to fall, a steady, rhythmic patter against the high glass windows that seemed to wash away the thick, suffocating tension that had held the village captive for 2 agonizing days. Inside the reading room, the small circle of remaining villagers sat in a state of exhausted quiet. Henrietta Dashwood was slumped in a chair by the cold radiator, her face still pale, but her breathing finally steady. Major Sterling stood near the dark window, staring out into the blackness of the high street, his fingers mindfully tracing the polished handle of his walking cane. "To think he was one of us," the Major muttered, his voice hollow and deeply troubled. "A man we trusted with our health, our families, our deepest secrets. He sat at our tables, drank our tea, and all the while he was a thief and a cold-blooded executioner. It makes one question whether you can ever truly know a person. Mrs. Beatrice Thorne sat rigidly opposite him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For the first time in memory, her formidable chest did not heave with righteous indignation. Instead, she looked incredibly old and deeply tired. "He played upon our vanities," she said softly, staring at the empty floorboards where the single tallow candle had finally burned itself down to a greasy smudge. "He knew I would blame the modern youth. He knew you would blame a prankster, and he knew poor Higgins would see a chance for profit. He used our own flaws to blind us." Miss Marple quietly packed her knitting needles away, smoothing the fluffy white wool of the unfinished baby garment before placing it neatly into her willow basket. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely peaceful, as if she were merely preparing to leave a particularly dull meeting of the Stitching Society rather than the scene of a double homicide. "People are not quite so unpredictable as they like to think." "Dear Beatrice," Miss Marple murmured, her faded blue eyes reflecting the soft ambient light of the restored electricity. "Human nature is remarkably uniform, you see. Whether it is in a grand place like London or a quiet little corner like Okevane, the motivators remain exactly the same." Doctor. Shepherd was a very clever man, yes, but he suffered from the greatest weakness of all clever people. He believed everyone else was completely foolish. "But how did you see it so clearly, Miss Marple?" Henrietta asked, raising her head to look at the old lady with a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. The rest of us were completely terrified, running in circles and accusing one another. "Well, my dear, it is simply a matter of observation," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "He reminded me so very much of old Mr. Smedley, the chemist, back in St. Back. Mary Mead. Mr. Smedley was always the very first to arrive whenever there was an accident in the village, always so terribly helpful, always offering bandages and advice. It took us nearly 3 years to realize that he was the one loosening the loose stones on the church stile in the first place, just so he could sell his special liniment to the poor people who tripped over them. He enjoyed the feeling of being the town's savior, you see." She stood up, adjusting her warm woolen cloak around her frail shoulders and picking up her umbrella from the corner hook. "When a man goes out of his way to make himself indispensable during a crisis," Miss Marple continued, walking slowly toward the exit, "it is usually because he knows exactly how the crisis was manufactured. The blank cartridge, the ointment, the torn fabric, they were all just individual threads. Once you see the pattern of the cloth, the identity of the weaver becomes quite inescapable." The village of Oakhaven would wake tomorrow to a new reality, one tinged with a lingering air of unease and a newfound suspicion among neighbors. But for Miss Marple, as she stepped out into the cool, rain-washed night, the world remained exactly as it had always been, a place of great beauty, but one where the shadow of human weakness was always waiting just beneath the surface. Chapter 11. The rain continued to fall in a steady, rhythmic drone as Miss Marple walked down the quiet high street of Oakhaven. The wet cobblestones reflected the amber glow of the gas lamps, creating long, shimmering ribbons of light that stretched into the damp autumn night. Her umbrella was held firmly at an angle to ward off the biting wind, her steady steps mirroring the absolute calm that had settled over her mind now that the dreadful business at the library was resolved. Upon reaching her rented rooms at Rose Cottage, she was greeted by the comforting, familiar warmth of a crackling peat fire. Her landlady, Mrs. Gable, who shared nothing but a name with the leek hiding woman of St. Ian. Mary Mead had thoughtfully left a small tray on the sideboard. It held a porcelain pot of chamomile tea, covered tightly with a hand-knitted cozy, and a small plate of dried ginger biscuits. Miss Marple shed her damp cloak, hung her umbrella in the porcelain stand in the hallway, and sat down in the high-backed armchair near the hearth. She poured herself a steaming cup of tea, letting the fragrant vapor soothe her tired eyes. For a long while, she simply watched the orange flames dance along the logs, her mind gently turning over the events of the past 48 hours. An outsider might think it strange that an elderly lady could witness such cold-blooded malice and remain entirely untroubled. But Miss Marple knew that ignoring the existence of wickedness never prevented it from happening. The tragedy of Dr. Shepherd was not that he was a monster born of some unusual, exotic evil. It was that he was so thoroughly ordinary in his selfishness. He had desired wealth and status, and when his petty thefts threatened to unmask his true character, he had simply chosen to destroy others to preserve his own comfortable position. It was a pattern she had seen repeated 100 times in 100 different guises. Human nature, she reflected as she took a slow sip of her tea, was remarkably like a standard dressmaker's pattern. The fabric might change from velvet to gingham, and the trimmings might be lavish or plain, but the basic shape of the garment remained entirely identical. A quiet knock at the sitting-room door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Gable peered inside, her face etched with the peculiar mixture of horror and intense curiosity that always follows a local scandal. "Excuse me, Miss Marple, dear, but the milkman just stopped by the back door to leave the extra cream, and he says the whole village is in an absolute uproar. They say Dr. Shepherd has already confessed to everything on the drive over to the Milchester Gale." "I am not at all surprised to hear that, Mrs. Gable," Miss Marple replied mildly, setting her teacup down with a gentle click. "A man who takes that much pride in his own cleverness can rarely bear to let someone else take the credit for his ingenuity, even when that ingenuity has led him straight to the gallows. He will want the lawyers to know exactly how he managed the trick with the starter's pistol." "Twice. It's just so dreadful," Mrs. Gable sighed, wiping her hands on her checkered apron. "To think we let him tend to our ailments. I shall never look at a bottle of medicine the same way again. The village won't look the same either, I fancy." "Oh, I shouldn't say that," Miss Marple said reassuringly. "Oakhaven is a very resilient place. By next week, the autumn fair will be upon us, and Mrs. Thorne will be arguing just as fiercely about the placement of the tombola. And Henrietta will be quite safely managing her books again. People must get on with the business of living, you see. It is their nature." After her landlady had retired for the night, Miss Marple reached into her basket and pulled out the white baby garment once more. The wool was soft and clean, untouched by the dark stains that had marred the library archive. As her needles resumed their familiar rhythmic clicking, she felt a profound sense of peace. The shadow had passed over Oakhaven, the truth had been brought into the light, and justice would take its natural course. She would finish this sleeve tonight, she decided, and perhaps tomorrow she would take the morning train back home to Sainty Mac, Mary Mead, where the celery was just coming into season. Chapter 12. The morning sun rose over Oakhaven with an extraordinary, crisp clarity, as if the severe downpour of the previous night had completely washed the atmosphere clean of its heavy secrets. The deep puddles along the station platform mirrored a pale, pearlescent sky, and the bracing autumn air smelled wonderfully of wet earth and wood smoke. Miss Marple stood quietly beside her modest leather suitcase, wrapped securely in her thick tweed cloak, waiting patiently for the 9:15 train that would carry her back to the familiar, comforting routines of St. Anne's. Mary Mead. She was not left alone on the platform for long. Before the distant, low whistle of the locomotive could be heard echoing across the valley. The platform gate creaked open, and Henrietta Dashwood came hurrying toward her. The young librarian looked remarkably different today. The crushing weight of suspicion had been completely lifted from her shoulders, and a touch of healthy, youthful color had finally returned to her cheeks. She held a small, neatly wrapped square parcel, tied with a bright blue satin ribbon. "I was so terribly afraid I should miss your departure, Miss Marple," Henrietta said, her breath coming in short, hurried puffs in the chilly morning air. "I wanted to bring you this before your train arrived. It is a small token of appreciation from the library committee, and from myself, most of all. It is a rare 19th century botanical study we happen to have in duplicate. I know how much you enjoy tending to your garden." Miss Marple's face creased into a warm, genuinely delighted smile as she accepted the gift. "Oh, my dear Henrietta, that is most extraordinarily kind of you. A truly beautiful thought. I shall treasure it immensely, especially when the winter frost sets in and I am stuck indoors dreaming of my spring delphiniums. We can never truly repay you for what you did last night," Henrietta continued softly, looking down at the wet platform boards. The village is still in such a state of utter shock. Mrs. Thorne has actually cancelled the committee meeting for next Tuesday, which is completely unprecedented. Major Sterling spent the entire morning at the police station, assisting Constable Evans with the inventory of the rare maps. It all still feels like a dreadful, impossible nightmare. It is always a shock when the illusion of absolute security is broken, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, placing a comforting gloved hand on Henrietta's arm. But you must not let the wickedness of one desperate man harden your heart against the world. Oakhaven is full of good, decent people who care for you deeply. Even Major Sterling, for all his gruff military manners, was profoundly concerned for your safety throughout this terrible ordeal. Human beings are capable of great folly, but they are also capable of wonderful kindness. The distant rumble of the approaching train began to vibrate through the metal tracks, and a white plume of steam appeared above the line of distant willow trees. Henrietta smiled bravely, blinking back a sudden prickle of emotional tears. I shall remember that, Miss Marple, and I promise I shall keep a much closer eye on my keys from now on. A very sensible precaution, dear, Miss Marple agreed with a knowing twinkle in her eyes, though I suspect you will find that the village will be exceptionally quiet for a very long time to come. Evil, when it is so thoroughly exposed, tends to make the remaining inhabitants quite remarkably well behaved. With Henrietta's assistance, Miss Marple boarded the third-class carriage, settling herself comfortably into a corner seat next to the window pane. She arranged her wicker knitting basket on the seat beside her, adjusting her spectacles as the train gave a sudden, heavy lurch and began to slowly pull away from the platform. She waved a final goodbye to the young woman until the small station building vanished entirely behind a bend in the tracks. As the train gathered speed, rattling rhythmically through the golden-brown fields of the English countryside, Miss Marple leaned her head back against the cushioned seat. She felt a deep, satisfying sense of completion. The puzzle of Oakhaven was solved. The innocent had been completely vindicated, and the guilty would face the proper consequences of their actions. She reached into a basket and drew out the white wool, her needles immediately resuming their comforting, familiar dance. There was still a great deal of knitting to finish before she reached her destination. And after all, Mary Mead was waiting for her,